Welcome to episode 72 of the MMA Rundown podcast. I'll be talking about the main event between Frankie Edgar and Pedro Munhoz, where Frankie Edgar was able to get the win by split decision. So I'll talk about that fight, recap the rest of the card for UFC Vegas 7, which was not exactly the strongest card and not exactly the biggest card either, but I'll go through the rest of the fights there. Preview the card that's coming up on the 29th or next Saturday. That one will be headlined by Anthony Smith and Alexander Wreckage. We'll be talking about Jon Jones vacating his title at light heavyweight, his future plans, and also where the division goes from there. Sort of in line with that, the next topic beyond that would be Rumble Johnson, who it seems like just an hour after Jon Jones vacated his title, Rumble announced that he was going back into the testing pool. He had in the past talked about coming back, but hadn't actually entered the testing pool. I think at this point he is announcing that he is entering the testing pool. But rather than going to heavyweight, he's planning to go back to 205, so that definitely makes the division a lot more interesting. From there, I'll be talking about the return of the return of fans at live UFC events. It sort of ties in with the Jon Jones thing, and I'll sort of bring it up twice, but I think at some point fans are going to come back to the UFC, and I think it's a little bit sooner than Dana White's letting on, so I'll talk about that. Recap what we've learned over the course of the week regarding Sean O'Malley. So last week we were pretty much just guessing, based off of limited information, how bad the injury was. Was it a pre-existing injury? Was it something where it was completely caused by Marlon Vera? How long is O'Malley going to be out? We know a little bit more now, so I'll talk about what we know now and what we've learned, and also I guess what we've learned about Sean O'Malley as a person in terms of how he has handled the loss. I'll talk about a topic that came up in the post-fight press conference at UFC Vegas 7, which is a cross-promotion with Bellator. So talk about some of the divisions where that might make sense. Mention that Vadim Nemkov just won the light heavyweight title over Ryan Bader, and talk about a couple other topics like that. And then the last thing I'll get to will be a handful of fight announcements, and there are some pretty decent ones here. No title fights yet, although there are some that seem like they're going to be coming soon, but there were still a bunch of good fights that were announced. So back to the top, we have Pedro Munhoz versus Frankie Edgar, and I guess one more thing to add on as well. If you guys had read the comments in the past when there was some talk about potentially making some nicer videos in the future, at least for the podcast, at least for the next live stream, I'll probably at least try to have like a nicer live stream for that. The last live stream that I did do, the one where I had the background image with the post-fight show, that actually got taken down by the UFC. It wasn't like there was a copyright strike or anything. They just took that video down, so I'll have to reimagine that. But that's why this is back to the normal, basically the headliner style video where it's just the image and then the audio wave and going through all the topics. So anyway, back to the actual topic at hand, though, which is Pedro Munhoz versus Frankie Edgar. This was a really interesting fight in terms of how it could be judged, because a lot of these rounds were really close. And just watching it live is sort of tough, but then also when you look at the stats, it was tough. I think one of the things that's worth mentioning is that Frankie Edgar really fought this like a vintage Frankie Edgar fight, in that he was trying to stay on the outside, land a lot of combos. A lot of the combos that he is landing, it's not as though he's going full power with them. A lot of them are sort of like at a lower rate. I don't know that I would say half power, but they're definitely at a lower power. He would mix in some hard shots too. It's not as though he was only throwing like pillow punches. Like he was also throwing some hard punches too. But a lot of the shots he was landing weren't exactly the hardest. So for him, he had the volume there. The wrestling wasn't really there. He tried to bring it in the second round and was at least doing enough to get some takedowns. But the thing is, every time he would take Pedro Munhoz down, it would pretty much end up in this sort of like back and forth situation where Pedro Munhoz would threaten with a guillotine. Edgar would sort of jump towards the correct side to defend it. Then Munhoz would switch over to like a wrestling switch to try to come back up, and then would be able to create some space and get back up to his feet. So Edgar really didn't do anything on top once he got there. Munhoz really wasn't on bottom for much. The guillotines that he was threatening weren't exactly like actual guillotine choke attempts. It's more so that he was going for the chin strap grip with his right arm. Was realizing that Edgar was doing the proper thing to defend it, so he never really committed to it beyond that. So the grappling really wasn't a major factor in this fight. I guess it was enough for Edgar to win the second round, and I think all three judges gave him that second round, but it really didn't play much of a role outside of that. The striking is where most of this fight took place. It was mostly with Pedro Munhoz walking Edgar down and throwing pretty much every shot that he threw was pretty heavy, whereas with Edgar it was sort of a mix of some hard shots and some not so hard shots. And by the end of it, I kind of figured that round one went to Pedro Munhoz. I think, and again, these stats could get fixed up, because one of the things that was really noticeable to me, and again, there's a difference between the person who's keeping stats and the actual announcers, but you'd have Pedro Munhoz throw a right hand, and then Edgar would come back with like a 4-punch combo. And the way the announcers made it sound, they're like, oh, wow, well, for every one punch that Munhoz is landing, Edgar's landing 4 more. But in reality, like, of those 4 punches that Edgar landed, like 3 of them were blocked, and the one they got through wasn't necessarily at full power. It might have been partially blocked too. So I'm not entirely sure how accurate the stats were in terms of actual strikes, because there is a big difference between a punch that gets through straight to the head and a punch that gets blocked by the forearm. And those things can be tough to tell, especially in real time. So I don't know how accurate the stats were and if there have been any major adjustments made to them. But even still, I felt as though Munhoz had done enough to win that first round just by pushing forward. Third round was one that was a lot tougher to score. I kind of felt like at the time Edgar probably had done enough to win that one, but again, that one was super close. So then, at least on my scorecard, it would have been 2-1. Fourth round, that one Munhoz looked a lot better, and I think all three judges gave Munhoz that round as well. So I actually saw it 2-2 heading into the last round. A few other people may have seen a 3-1 for Munhoz, including one of the judges who gave Munhoz a 4-1 unanimous decision. And then fifth round, it was sort of that same type of thing again, where you have Munhoz walking Edgar down, landing the heavier shots. Edgar's doing okay with volume, but a lot of the shots that he's landing are either getting blocked or they're not necessarily at full power. So it's one of those things where it's like if one guy lands 20 shots, the other guy lands 20 shots, but one of the guys is throwing full power every time. The other guy is throwing half power like half the time. Generally, the guy who's throwing full power more often than not is going to win that round unless the guy who's throwing at half power and half the time and full power the other half the time actually like knocked the guy down or stumbled him or did enough to actually hurt him. And I really didn't feel like that was the case in that fifth round. There were a couple times where Munhoz sort of stumbled a little bit, but more like he was tripped than like he was actually, or more like he was like off balance than it was that he was like rocked or hurt by the punch. So I thought that Munhoz had done enough to win it. It goes to the decision. Two of the judges gave Edgar 3 rounds, although it wasn't the same 3 rounds they picked. And then one of the judges went 4 rounds to 1 for Munhoz, so Edgar gets the win. As far as where they go from here, for Edgar, it's a big win. It's a win over a top 5 guy at bantamweight, and in a way, it was sort of like a vintage Edgar performance. Maybe less so with the wrestling, but at least with the striking, it was sort of what we had seen in the past, where it's kind of like that hummingbird style, where he's kind of like on the outside, using a lot of footwork, landing a few pitter-patter punches, getting out of the pocket, landing a few pitter-patter punches, getting out of the way. So for him, it's definitely enough for him to now insert himself into the middle of the top 10. As far as where he goes from here, I don't know that any of the guys ranked ahead of him are going to be open for him to fight next, so I think he's probably going to have to fight someone who's ranked a little below him, which is fine anyway. And again, this is me assuming that he's going to take Munhoz's spot and sort of be like a number 5 or a number 6. Fight a lot of people are talking about is Dominic Cruz. I think that would be a great fight to make. I don't really see Edgar as being a guy who's going to make a title run here at bantamweight. If he does, it's more so going to be because it takes him like 1 or 2 wins and all of a sudden he gets pushed into there, but I don't think that he's really at the same level as some of the other top contenders in this division. So for me, a fight with Dominic Cruz I think would be a great one just from a style matchup. I think it's a fight that a lot of people wanted to see for a while. Granted, we're not going to get it with these two in their primes, but it's still going to be a fun fight to watch. And it's going to be interesting to see how their styles that are somewhat similar end up working out against each other. So for me, the fight to make with Frankie Edgar is going to be against Dominic Cruz. It's a big name for him. It's not as though he sinks down in the division regardless, so I think for him that's probably the fight to make. For Pedro Munhoz, it sucks because he probably should still be like in that middle of the top 10 range and be looking to fight someone else, possibly even Cruz himself. But that's not really going to be on the table. Maybe Jose Aldo's the guy to put him up against. I would prefer that Jose Aldo moves back to featherweight and doesn't have to keep starving himself to make 135, but if he wants to stay at 135, he's an adult. Like, he gets to make those decisions. So if that's what he wants to keep doing, then Munhoz versus Aldo would be a pretty good fight to make. You could potentially do Aldo versus Edgar, but we've seen that fight a couple times at featherweight. I don't know that we need to see it to be a fight between a couple of middle-ranked bantamweights at this point. So Munhoz versus Aldo makes sense to me. Cruz versus Edgar makes sense to me. And for Munhoz, if he beats Aldo, then he's kind of right back to where he started here. And then for Edgar, if he gets a win over Cruz, that's a big name win for him. And he can try to sort of build, rather than having to beat a top 10 or like a top 5 guy to earn a title shot, maybe he can try to like take a win over Cruz and work his way into a title fight. I don't know that he'd be successful with it, but that could potentially be a route for him. But that's where I'd like to see each of those guys go. The fight that should have been in the co-main event would have been Alonzo Menafield versus Ovince St. Preux. St. Preux tested positive for COVID the day of and had to get pulled out. I mentioned this before with Joe Mearshart. It seems like with Mearshart, he actually did have COVID. It seems as though he actually was sick afterwards. But it does seem odd to me that they sort of have a bubble set up with these guys. They're coming in early in the week. They start their weight cuts like around a Tuesday or Wednesday, and they're finally testing positive on Saturday or late Friday. I don't know if it's one of those things where these aren't the rapid response tests and they're keeping guys around that could potentially have COVID while they're waiting on the results. But it does seem weird to me that they would enter what's effectively like a light bubble or like a form of a bubble, and you're having guys who are testing positive late in the process. But either way, they lost OSP for that fight, so they couldn't make that fight happen. I think he'll probably get rescheduled for September. So the fight that did end up being the co-main event was Mike Rodriguez versus Marcin Prakniel. Rodriguez was clearly the better striker in this fight and was able to knock Prakniel down pretty quickly and get the finish on the ground. Austin Hubbard versus Joe Selecky was the fight before that. Hubbard looked fantastic in his last fight against Max Roscoff. Had a couple moments in that Roscoff fight, especially early on, where Roscoff was able to take him down and threaten with some submission attempts, but Hubbard did a really good job of defending, and then from there was able to keep the fight standing and was able to dominate from there. So then in the Selecky fight, Selecky was able to get him down pretty quickly, took his back standing, and he kind of figured, okay, well, Hubbard's going to find a way out of this one again, too. But Selecky was just very tight, very deliberate, just slowly and steadily kept improving his position until he was finally able to sink in a choke. Had it slightly over the jaw, but still had the same, had a crank where he was cranking the jaw down and still could get a choke, and was able to do enough there to win by submission over Austin Hubbard. So a big win for Selecky. The fight before that was between Maria Agapova and Shayna Dobson. This fight probably should have been on the Street Beefs YouTube channel rather than on a UFC card, but I guess both of these ladies have earned a spot in the UFC. I guess earned is sort of an interesting word to use there, but they're both in the UFC. Agapova, I guess, very aggressive, is able to overwhelm a lot of her opponents and has had success doing so. Tried to do the same thing here with Dobson, but wasn't terribly successful with it. Not the most technical performance out of her, but was just very aggressive and just using all the energy she had early. Didn't work out for her. She ended up gassing before the end of the second round. Dobson was able to get on top of her, land some good ground and pound, and did enough to get the stoppage win. So for Agapova, tough loss there. For Dobson, she goes from 3-4 back to 4-4 and gets a big win there as an underdog. But this just was not a very exciting fight. Not a great fight for either of them. I guess for Dobson, it's got to feel good to get the win there, especially against someone who called you out, against someone who people thought going in was going to be a top prospect. But Agapova definitely got exposed here as someone who's just kind of really physical and really aggressive, but not necessarily all that technical. And Dobson, I guess, was tough enough to hang in there long enough to let Agapova wear herself down, and then was able to take over later on after that. And then we had a really fun fight between Daniel Rodriguez and Dwight Grant. Grant had knocked Rodriguez down pretty early. Was going for the finish. Rodriguez was able to hang tight, was able to work his way back up to his feet, and then started landing on Dwight Grant. Was able to drop him, and then had him hurt up against the fence, dropped him again after he was initially dropped, and on the second drop, that was enough for the ref to step in and stop the fight. So he was lucky that the ref allowed, I think it was Chris Tione, who allowed him to fight through the first knockdown, work his way back up, and then he was able to come back and get a win. That's something that'll come back up again. On the prelims, we had Amanda Lemos versus Mizuki Inoue. Lemos looked pretty good early. In the later round, Inoue was just trying to hold her up against the fence, but really wasn't doing anything there. And Lemos was able to do enough after that to steal the round and win all 3 rounds. Fight before that was Jordan Wright versus Ike Villanueva. Wright was headed in 10-0 versus Villanueva, who was 16-10. So Villanueva had as many losses as Wright had wins. I guess they're still at that exact point now, because Villanueva now has 11 losses and Wright now has 11 wins. But Wright had a lot of success early with the kicks and was able to hurt Villanueva, and then was able to get the finish in the first round in about 90 seconds. Fight before that was Carlton Minus versus Matthew Semmelsberger. Semmelsberger just had a much higher output than Minus did for most of this fight, and through that he was able to get the win there. I believe won by a unanimous decision. And then the first fight on the card was between Timur Valiev and Trevin Jones. I was kind of surprised that Trevin Jones was not stopped in the first round. So he was hit with a really hard body shot by Valiev, and the Valiev just kept wailing away at him. And it seemed as though Jones was kind of waiting on the ref to step in, but the ref never did. He just kind of let him keep going. So Jones was like, okay, I guess I'll keep trying here. But it was like a minute of him almost getting finished. He was able to survive it. Just into the second round, and then in the second round lands a nice check right hook to drop Valiev. Valiev's hurt on his back. Jones is still landing ground and pound. It seemed as though there could have been a little bit more time that Valiev could have been given, especially given all the time that Jones had. Now, granted, Jones was hurt to the body, not to the head, although he was taking some hard headshots while he was protecting the body. But either way, Valiev gets stopped here. He kept wrestling through, like wrestling the ref afterwards. It wasn't entirely clear whether that was an issue where it's like he didn't know where he was and he thought he was wrestling Jones, or whether he was just like really angry and was just kind of protesting through it. But either way, really big win for Trevin Jones, moving from 12-6 to 13-6. Valiev had a good amount of hype heading into this fight, was a major favorite, and took the loss here. As far as what I saw from Valiev in terms of him being a guy who could become a future star, you really didn't get to see a whole lot of his grappling in this fight. I'm not entirely sure if he felt as though Jones was a better grappler than a striker and he wanted to win this on the feet, or Valiev just prefers to fight on the feet. Valiev, I guess if you're going to say something nice about his striking, he definitely throws a wide range of strikes. He throws a lot of feints in there as well. So it can be difficult to sort of time him and say, I know for a fact he's about to throw a right cross and I'm going to slip off center and then throw a cross of my own. Like it's not easy to do that with Valiev because he's constantly throwing from different angles and throwing different strikes. But with that being said, it seems that the mechanics are a little bit off on the strikes that he does throw. It doesn't seem like he gets full power on a lot of the shots that he throws, and definitely keeps his hands down a lot. So it seems as though while he's a tough guy to fight, once he gets up to the higher levels, if he's just going to strike with guys, he's definitely going to have some issues. So there are some who think that this is just one of those things where he just got caught, but he's going to be back and he's going to be a guy. He'll be in the top 15 in no time. I'll have to see more of him, but just based off what I saw in this fight, it seems as though a lot of the hype that was given to him may not exactly be warranted. But this is the only fight I've seen of Valiev, so it's not as though I'm like any kind of expert on what he does or what he's capable of, but that's just based off of what I've seen so far. So next card to talk about is going to be the card coming up on Saturday. That'll be headlined by Anthony Smith versus Alexander Wreckage. Wreckage is going to be the favorite in this fight, which I think is a little bit surprising to me. I actually would figure that Smith would be the favorite here. Just based off of skill alone, Anthony Smith is the more skilled fighter between Smith and Wreckage. Wreckage is a little more athletic, a little more explosive than Smith is, and I guess for that reason it's had some pretty nice wins to his record, some really cool looking head kick knockouts. But Wreckage tends to do really well early in a fight, but so does Smith. Smith tends to get tired later on in fights too, but maybe not to the same degree that we saw with Wreckage when he fought against Ozdemir. So I think first round is definitely going to be an explosive round, and sure, Wreckage can hit really hard. He definitely has a chance to knock Smith out, but Smith's a tough guy. It's not so he's an easy guy to knock out, and I think he'll be able to survive whatever Wreckage can bring there, and I think over time as the fight goes on, the longer the fight goes, the more that's going to work in Smith's favor. The one thing I'd be worried about with Anthony Smith is that he just had that loss to Glover Teixeira that looked really bad, where he's taking a prolonged beating beyond the point where it looked like that fight was basically over. So you could question, okay, well, if Anthony Smith is still pretty damaged from that fight and he's fighting too soon right now, maybe that's going to be a problem for him, and I guess that's a decent argument to make. But just based off of what we have seen from Smith in the past, I think he should be able to survive the early flurries from Wreckage and then be able to take this fight over late. In the co-main event, we have Robbie Lawler versus Neil Magney. This was supposed to be Jeff Neal versus Neil Magney. Jeff Neal had some health issues, and at least in his words and his coach's words, it was kind of like on the brink of death at one point, so it's good that he's doing better now, but obviously he wasn't able to make this fight anymore. But we're still going to get a good one between Lawler and Magney. It's sort of tough to tell with Lawler just because over time he just hasn't been the same fighter that he was back when he was the champion. Less aggressive on the feet, sort of less fearsome. I don't know that I see this fight going to the ground. I think it's mostly going to be standing. Magney may try to clinch it up and sort of win some minutes in the clinch. But I think for the most part they're going to be at a distance, standing. I think Magney's probably going to throw a little bit more volume than Lawler is. So for Lawler, he's going to have to land some serious shots here to actually hurt Magney and to take over the fight, whether it's to get a finish or whether it's to get an early knockdown and really ride that momentum all the way through. So I think there's a decent chance that Magney wins this fight just based off what I've seen from Robbie Lawler recently. But again, Robbie's a former champion, incredibly powerful, especially for the weight class, and always going to be dangerous to deal with. Fight before that will be Ji Yun Kim versus Alexa Grasso. Don't know a whole lot about Kim, so it's sort of tough to break that fight down. We should have had a fight between Ryan Hall and Ricardo Lomas. Unfortunately, Ryan Hall got injured. He initially was supposed to take this fight with Lomas, and Lomas, I believe, was injured the last time. So it seems like this is the second time that this fight has fallen through. Not sure if the UFC is going to try to remake the fight. It's not clear what the injury to Ryan Hall was. So it's sort of tough to say how long it's going to take. If this was like a short-term thing where Hall could be back in a month, then maybe they're going to try to remake the fight. If not, then I'm sure they'll look for someone else for Lomas, and Hall will have to find someone else who's either ranked in the top 15 or who has a big enough name and is no longer ranked, but is sort of like on the fringe, sort of like Lomas is, to get a big win against. I think a lot of people are going to be really upset about this because they feel like Ryan Hall's sort of wasting away amidst his prime. To an extent, that's definitely true. I think Ryan Hall could have fought a lot more and could have been a lot busier, and we could have seen a lot more from him. But with that being said, I personally don't see Ryan Hall as a future UFC champion. I don't even necessarily see him as a guy who's going to hang around like in the top 10 for a long period of time. I think the more guys he fights, the more he'd kind of fall off. And that's not like a knock on Ryan Hall more so than it's just the style that he has. Granted, he has a unique style for a jiu-jitsu guy, but it seems as though his style at times can definitely cause some problems for him. Yes, his striking can be decent for point fighting because he's really good at landing from range, but he keeps his hands down a lot. He's definitely open to get hit a lot. His takedowns where he's actually shooting on you and putting you on your back aren't the best. He has pretty good Imanari rolls, but again, if you know that's coming, it's easier to defend against. It's something that you can game plan for and find a way to work around. So he's a guy who anyone who fights him is always going to have to be careful and always have to mind their P's and Q's, but this is a guy who, when he won the Ultimate Fighter, he didn't actually win every fight in the house. He actually got knocked off in the house against a guy who Sal Rogers, I believe is the guy's name, who I don't even know if he's with Bellator anymore. He might be back to Cage Warriors. But given that was the Ultimate Fighter, people tend to forget about that. I guess same thing kind of goes for Paulo Boachina, where he had lost a fight on the Ultimate Fighter, and then is still known as this undefeated beast. But Boachina is a different case than Ryan Hall. Boachina actually has pretty good wrestling, really powerful striking, and his jiu-jitsu is more so just position based and just trying to get back up, or if he's on top, then sort of like managing position and ground and pound. And then the other fight that is on the card is going to be Magomed, or on the main card is going to be Magomed Ankalaev and Ion Kutilaba. Again, we've seen this fight already. Kutilaba pretended to be hurt early on. Ankalaev, I don't know that he really fell for it, but the ref definitely did, so he stepped in too soon and they had to stop the fight. So these guys will have another shot to go at. It'll be interesting to see how this one works out. If the ref is willing to give Kutilaba a little bit too much leniency here, and if he gets actually hurt, if Kutilaba has to take a few extra shots that he wouldn't have otherwise taken as a result of that last fight, we'll see. But this is still a fun fight to watch, and I'm excited to see it for Ankalaev at least, because Ankalaev's a really fun fighter to watch at 205, and one of those guys who I think could definitely start working his way up the rankings pretty quickly. And the prelims, we have Maki Botolo versus Impa Kasangani. Impa just fought on the Contender Series and had a pretty good performance, so he'll be fighting Botolo. We've got Mallory Martin versus Hannah Cyphers. Cyphers, I'm surprised is still with the UFC, but I think if she takes a loss here, that'll probably be it for her. She's had a lot of opportunities against a handful of pretty big names. I think recently she had the loss to Agapova, who just lost yesterday. But before that, she had lost to Mackenzie Dern and also lost to Macy Barber. So she's gotten some interesting names to be in there with, but really hasn't had any good results against any of them. So hopefully for her, she gets one over Mallory Martin and at least hangs around a little bit longer, but it seems as though her UFC career is sort of in the balance here. Then we've got Alessio Dicharrico versus Zach Cummings. Alex Caceres versus Giga Chikadze. This is going to be a really fun one. Chikadze should definitely be the better striker of the two. Caceres is still a fun guy to watch, though, because he throws a lot of different strikes. We'll see if there's any grappling in this fight, but I think for the most part it'll be on the feet, and I think Chikadze should have the advantage there. We got Saperbek Safarov, who's surprisingly still in the UFC. I guess the over-under on fouls that he commits in this fight should probably be at like plus 4.5. Taking the over on that probably won't be the worst bet either. But he'll be fighting Julian Marquez. We got Poliana Viana versus Emily Whitmire, and Sean Brady versus Christian Aguilera. So the next big topic to talk about is going to be Jon Jones and the UFC light heavyweight division. This is a very bizarre story to me because it's still unclear to me what exactly happened between Jon Jones and Dana White and what they were even talking about. So after the fight card with UFC 252, Jones was tweeting a lot about wanting to move to heavyweight, how he saw some holes in Stipe's game, and how I felt like he could beat Stipe. So at that point, it's kind of like, okay, well, we've seen guys who are champions of one division move up and try to become the double champ. It seems like that's probably what Jon Jones is talking about here, so maybe he wants to be a double champ against Stipe. Stipe weighed in at like 230 pounds. Jon Jones, you would figure, can't be a whole lot lighter than that, assuming that he's not even at the same size or bigger when he's fighting at 205. So it's like, okay, seems like it makes sense. Jones is interested in fighting Stipe. Hopefully he's able to negotiate with the UFC. There was that issue a little while back where the Francis Ngannou fight was brought up, and then he felt as though the UFC was lowballing him on that, and then just sort of like threw a bit of a tantrum and went to his room. We didn't really hear from him for a while, up until the UFC 252 card. So it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe the fight against Stipe will get him a better offer, and he'll be willing to take that. But after a fairly brief negotiation, he announced that he was giving up his UFC light heavyweight title, and that he was effectively going to take a break for up to 6 months, where he'll still be training just to make sure that he's still working on his skills, but that he didn't figure that he was going to fight, and as long as the UFC was going to make these types of offers that they were making to him, then he was basically done. And then, like, within a day of that, was like, actually, I've just been talking to the UFC later, and it seems like we're actually getting closer, so it seems like there's a decent chance that we will come to an agreement. So then at that point, it's like, well, then why did you get rid of the 205-pound championship? Like, it just doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of long-term thinking that was put into this. If he was, like, legitimately, like, not going to fight for whatever they were paying him and wanted to be done, and then he decided to give up his belt, that's one thing. But for him to give up his belt and then the next day be like, actually, you know what, now I'm getting closer to signing a deal with the UFC to take out a fight at heavyweight, it just seems kind of odd. And again, I don't know what the timing on this is all going to be. Stipe Miocic just got out of a really tough fight with Daniel Cormier. His next opponent should be Francis Ngannou. That's what Dana White said. how quickly do you want to put Stipe in there with Francis Ngannou? How quickly is Stipe going to take a fight with Francis Ngannou? I mean, if it's in the next 3 months, I'd be surprised. If it's in the next, 5 months, that might make a little more sense. Probably, 6 months from now. So if those guys fight in 6 months, then you need, another 3 or 4 months after that. John Jones might not have another fight for 10 months if his next fight is going to be for a heavyweight title. And that's sort of being optimistic on the timeline there. So I'm not entirely sure why John Jones felt the need to give up his light heavyweight title. If he was at a point where he's getting close financially to working with the UFC on a deal, even if it was just for a heavyweight fight. So maybe he's going to fight someone else in the meantime at heavyweight. But again, those guys are starting to get taken up. We just had Curtis Blades and Derek Lewis get put together. So it seems as though the long-term thinking is kind of lacking here with John Jones and his negotiations. But it seems like with him, things can pop up at any time. So I'm curious to see where things go from here. But it doesn't seem like the right idea for him, unless he's just tired of making 205 and he just wants to commit to heavyweight now. But it just seems kind of odd given the timing. But given that he's gone, it means that someone's going to fight for the title and someone's going to be champion. And a fight that was already scheduled between Jan Blachowicz and Dominic Reyes is now going to be a title fight. That fight will be happening in September. As far as how I think this fight's going to go, it's sort of tough to me. Blachowicz should have the advantage on the ground. I don't know how aggressive he's going to be about taking this fight to the ground. I think for the most part, it's probably going to be on the feet. Reyes is probably going to give him a lot of trouble with his footwork. His angles, he's got very long punches as well. That could be trouble for Blachowicz. Blachowicz is pretty solid all around too, though. He has pretty good kicks as well. So it should be a pretty fun match. I think for the most part, it'll be on the feet. It'll be a pretty decent striking match, but either of these guys has a real shot to win it. The winner of that fight is probably... It seems right now that they're going to get the winner of Glover Teixeira and Thiago Santos, which makes sense. Thiago Santos is sort of like this odd man out, where he had that really close fight with John Jones that a lot of people thought he won. I was not among the people who thought he won that fight. I definitely felt like people were discounting the leg kicks way too much from John Jones, and the fact that Thiago Santos walked out of there with a couple blown out knees really speaks to the efficacy of those leg kicks. But with that being said, a lot of people thought that Santos had done enough to win, so therefore people wanted to see that rematch. Then Dominic Reyes came in, had another fight where people thought that Reyes should have won, and it seemed as though it could have made sense to go Reyes versus Santos, but in the meantime, Corey Anderson was working his way up there, Jan Blachowicz was working his way up, Blachowicz knocked out Corey Anderson, and so Blachowicz was able to put himself in there. So you had 3 guys who arguably could have had title fights lined up against John Jones, whether it was Santos, whether it was Reyes, or whether it was Blachowicz, all for different reasons, and ultimately Santos is the odd man out here, where he's not going to be in the interim / now actual title fight. So he'll have an opportunity to earn that spot, though, if he can get a win over Glover Teixeira, who's coming off of that win over Anthony Smith. Now with Rumble Johnson in the mix, I don't know if it's going to be 6 months from now until he can actually fight again. If that's the case, the division can move on a lot from then. I don't know that he would go right into a title fight immediately, but it seems like he's one of those guys where you put him in there quickly, whether it's a rematch with Glover Teixeira at that point or someone else, a dominant win for him, and he's going to be back in the title picture pretty quickly. And without a dominant wrestler holding the belt, it could definitely make things interesting and give him a real shot to win it. Next topic to talk about is, well, I guess I kind of talked about it just now, but it would have been Rumble Johnson coming back, but effectively I just talked about Rumble Johnson coming back and what it would take for him to, when he might be back actually in the cage, and what it's going to take for him to get a title fight. So the next thing to talk about after that is the return of fans to the UFC. And what really brought this up in my mind, and the reason why I'm bringing it up now, is I think a big reason why John Jones had issues with the UFC in the first place was because he wanted a big raise amidst a pandemic. One of the big things about the pandemic is that the UFC can't actually sell tickets, so they're not making any live gate numbers. So the UFC, it seems as though they're not making more money on their fights than they otherwise would, at least from the broadcast standpoint. They're definitely making money, that's why they're doing it, but it's not as though, like, a fight that happens in April is worth more to them than a fight that had happened in February. I think they're still making the same exact money from ESPN. So for them, it's kind of like you're making pretty similar money, maybe a little bit different with the pay-per-views, but you're not getting a gate. And for that reason, it's tough to offer a fighter more money unless they've actually proven that they're worth more money. Sort of like Sean O'Malley, who was getting paid $40,000, but was drawing a lot more attention, a lot more eyes than what that $40,000 warranted. And it seems as though he was definitely compensated more and was happy with what the UFC paid him. But for John Jones, when he's saying, I want to fight this guy and I want more money because it's a tougher fight, rather than I want more money because it's actually going to draw more money, that was sort of causing some issues with the UFC. But it does bring up the question that I've been thinking about lately, which is, when will there be fans back? You have to think the UFC is going to want to have fans at some point soon, just because it's going to bring back a bunch of money that they're otherwise not making right now. So then the question becomes, when is the UFC looking at bringing fans back, and is their public messaging on this actually in line with what they're actually thinking? And to me, I think that when Dana White says, look, we're not bringing back fans anytime soon, I don't entirely believe him because it doesn't seem like it makes the most business sense to just refuse to bring fans back. I think when you're signing a bunch of fights right now, if you say, yeah, we might be bringing fans back, I don't know, maybe late September, early October, well, now all of a sudden, every time you're trying to sign a guy to fight and you're sort of within that time frame, they might start saying, well, actually, I don't want to fight until there are fans back when there's a live gate, therefore I can make more money. And it can definitely muddy the water with negotiations. So if the UFC says, hey, we're looking at bringing fans back, possibly around this week of this month, or this time of this year, it can make negotiations a little bit more difficult for them. And I think for that reason, that's why Dana White has been so clear, at least in public, in saying, I'm not going to be bringing fans back. But at least, especially in the U.S. right now, we're going to be having college football coming back soon. We're going to be having the NFL coming soon as well. College football, there are a bunch of teams that are looking at anywhere between 25% and 50% in terms of stadium capacity. You're looking at Alabama, I think they're doing 50%. So I think that would be like up to 50,000 fans, either that or 25,000 fans. I know different teams are looking at different amounts. I think the University of Tennessee, they're looking at 25%. So again, you're looking at over 20,000 people going to college football games. For the NFL, the Kansas City Chiefs, I think, are doing 50%. So again, they're bringing 5 figures worth of fans into these stadiums to watch football games. This should be happening in mid to late September. If these attempts go off and there isn't any major issue with it, and if the NFL can continue to do this, if the NCAA can continue to do this, I don't see how Dana White doesn't look at that, doesn't see these partial audiences, and at least come back with a partial audience in the UFC, if not a full audience. He was pretty much the first guy to come back and say, hey, we're going to actually put on these sports. Not to say that the NFL wouldn't have been pushing for it. Well, college definitely wouldn't have, because college was one of the quick ones to get out of there in the first place. But it seems as though Dana White was sort of forward-thinking to actually get the events going in the first place and get sports going in the first place. It seems odd that he's not one of the guys pushing to have fans back immediately. He's going to get beat out by some smaller leagues already, and then also get beat out by the NFL and NCAA on that. But if the NFL and NCAA have success there, I just don't see Dana White still refusing to bring fans back. I think for him, he's going to bring fans back rather quickly. It's not going to be something that we're going to have an announcement on that like 2 months in advance. I think it's going to be one of those things where we're going to have a couple weeks to work on it. He'll probably do it where it's not going to be a full crowd immediately. And if that's the case, and it's not a full crowd, then you're kind of going to have a limited supply of tickets. You're probably going to have a lot of people who really want to go and see a live fight who haven't been able to in the last few months. So the demand will be there. So they'll still be able to make a decent amount of money on it. They're still going to profit off of the gate. I think that's something that's going to happen moving forward. But it does seem odd that the UFC would be, or that Dana White would be saying that he's not going to do it unless it's sort of like a negotiation tactic right now, because it seems like otherwise he's the type of guy who'd want to be among the first people to do this. So that's definitely something to look at moving forward. As far as when I think it's going to happen, it seems like a pay-per-view would make sense for it. The pay-per-view in September probably doesn't work out on timing, at least UFC 253. I think UFC 254 is going to be on Fight Island. It's going to be the Khabib versus Gaethje one. So that one might not necessarily make sense. So I think UFC 255, you're going to have a pay-per-view. You're probably going to have a pretty big fight at that point. So I think 255 at the latest, they'll probably be bringing fans back. And at that point, there'll be time to examine how it worked out in the NFL and how it worked out in the NCAA as far as having fans back, whether it's partial fans or whether you're going back to like a stadium full. So I think that's something to watch for moving forward. Next topic is going to be Sean O'Malley and him finally speaking and giving his side of what happened in the fight. And it wasn't entirely clear what he was saying. So he was saying that before the fight started that his ankle wraps were very tight, so tight that he was starting to lose circulation. He actually had to have him adjust it before he got out there. Didn't exactly explain why the ankle wraps need to be so tight in the first place. So again, this is something I mentioned on the post-fight thing, is that the ankle wraps, oftentimes, if you're wrapping both ankles, there's probably one ankle that's actually an issue, and the other ankle not as much. So for him, it seems like the ankle that actually was giving him issues here is that same ankle that he had wrapped super tight. So it does lend credence to the idea that there was an injury heading into the fight. But again, from there, then he was sort of saying that he took that kick, started wobbling on it, and lost his balance and was struggling from there. And he was saying, well, look, I felt like I should have won this fight. I felt like Marlon Vera was a bum. Like, he was slow. I should have been the better fighter. This was just a freak accident. He sucks. I'll be back. I'll be a champion. He'll be a journeyman. It's not a big deal. And if you take him for what he's saying and just kind of take it verbatim, that's a terrible attitude to look at things. And it's not one that really takes ownership of what happened in that fight leading up to the finish. Like, even if you think you're going to eat that same kick over and over and never have that same issue again, it just seems like there's a complete lack of ownership in what he was saying. With that being said, Sean O'Malley, better than most, and by most I mean like 99.9% of fighters, understands that as a professional athlete, he is a professional entertainer, and has really taken to that side really well and has done a great job of building a brand for himself. And so anytime he's talking in front of a mic, in front of a live mic, in front of a live camera, you kind of have to wonder whether he's like actually telling you what he thinks in his heart of hearts, or whether he's just trying to play a character. And for him, he really does a good job of playing a character. So for me, it's one of those things where it's like, on one hand, I want to like believe that he's saying exactly what he feels and like be upset about it, but on the other hand, it's like, this sort of makes sense given the character that he's built so far, and if he's sort of playing that role again, why would I like get too upset about it? Because it makes perfect sense for who he's supposed to be, or who he's supposed to be acting like. So for him, if he's going to take that approach and be like, yeah, this fight was basically nothing, I'll come back and I'll just destroy him, you know, maybe he gets a rematch and maybe he wins it. But I definitely think there are things to learn from this fight for Sean O'Malley, and he's still got a lot of work to do. But again, he's 25 years old. He has plenty of time to continue improving. But hopefully for him, his ankle gets better. And also, got to say, it was a really dumb move for him to post a video of him dancing and pretty much him being like, yeah, no, I'm fine. If you're going to get carted out as if you have like a serious ankle injury, you should probably at least like play it off as though that's the case, and either don't tell people the exact seriousness of your ankle injury, or just be like, yeah, it was pretty bad, but I don't want to be too specific because then my future opponents might use that intel against me, or at least do something like that. But if it wasn't as bad as it looked, I wouldn't go around a few days later starting strutting around and dancing and making it seem like you're just fine, because that makes you look bad when people watch the fight and then have you dancing a couple days later in the back of their head. Next topic is Bellator potentially cross-promoting with UFC. This was a question that was brought up a couple times at the post-fight press conference after UFC Vegas 7. I guess sort of the idea behind it was Vadim Nemkov had gotten a win over Ryan Bader, landed a huge head kick, and then was able to just swarm him from there. Ref really gave Bader a lot of time to work his way back up. Bader did work his way back up, but got knocked back down again. And eventually Nemkov was able to get the win there. So I guess the idea would be, with the UFC losing John Jones out of their light heavyweight division and him moving up to heavyweight, that maybe the UFC light heavyweight division isn't as strong as it had once seemed to be, and maybe a guy like Vadim Nemkov could really give a good challenge to Dominic Reyes or to Jan Blachowicz. From there was also some other ideas that were brought up, maybe bringing Juan Archuleta over, bringing Patricio Pitbull over. Dana White pretty much no-sold it, was saying, yeah, all the best guys in the light heavyweight division of Bellator are guys that the UFC didn't want anymore, whether it's Phil Davis, Corey Anderson, or Ryan Bader. To an extent, that's true. I guess they still kind of wanted some of them. At least Bader they wanted, I think, but he got a better deal with Bellator. Phil Davis, I don't remember what the case was with him, but I think it was the same type of thing where Bellator paid him more. But still, with that being said, that was Dana's point. They were then bringing out some other fighters, but it seemed as though there just wasn't a whole lot of interest from Dana White in terms of bringing Bellator guys over. As far as this actually happening, I don't see there being any way this is possibly going to happen unless Bellator gets bought out by the UFC. Could Bellator get bought out by the UFC? I guess that's a possibility. I'm not sure how they would want to go about that and where they're at. It seems as though there's like this court battle that never ends about them being this whole antitrust battle. I figured once that's over, once there's actually like some concrete statements made there, then maybe they might feel comfortable buying a Bellator. But right now, it kind of benefits the UFC, at least in that court case, for Bellator to operate on their own. But it does seem like Bellator is having some struggles business-wise, and getting bought out by the UFC, sort of like what happened with Strikeforce, won't be the worst thing for them. But I don't know if the UFC is going to make a move like that until the antitrust case is over. You know, there are other competitors other than Bellator. There is ONE FC. You have some other competitors that are overseas. It just seems like the UFC is probably better off from an antitrust standpoint letting Bellator exist in the form that they're at right now. Another thing worth mentioning for Bellator is that they have a title fight coming up. I think it actually is Juan Archuleta who's going to be in it at 135 against Patchy Mix. Mix has been a really exciting prospect to watch. Really good wrestling and fantastic back attacks. Really good at taking the back, but then also really good at controlling from the back and finding the rear naked choke. So he's one of those guys who I really want to see more from and see him fight some higher level competition. But he's looked fantastic against everyone he's fought against, and he'll be getting a title fight coming up in September. Last thing to talk about is going to be some fights that were announced. So a big one on bantamweight, we have Marlon Moraes versus Corey Sandhagen. This is going to be a really fun fight. Both of these guys are fantastic strikers, and I guess Moraes could attempt to take this fight to the ground. Moraes is a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Not that Sandhagen's bad on the ground, but Sandhagen did just have a problem with Sterling taking him down and getting a quick finish, so maybe Moraes tries to at least mix in some takedowns, but I think for the most part this will be a kickboxing fight, and it's going to be a really fun one at that. We've got Amanda Nunes defending her title against Megan Anderson. Megan Anderson, I guess, gets a title shot simply for existing. So she'll be fighting against Nunes. Anderson, I guess, has a decent amount of power, one of the stronger girls in the UFC, but really doesn't offer a whole lot more from a technique standpoint. I think Nunes should be able to run right through her, although you never know if Anderson's going to be able to clip her on the way in, but this should be a pretty easy win for Nunes. We'll have Darren Till versus Jack Hermanson, assuming that Darren Till's knee gets clearance. That should be in December. So this is a fight that was talked about. I didn't think that they'd be announcing it so soon because I thought that Till's knee would be worse off. He made it sound as though he blew out his knee. I believe that fight was in July. So to blow out your knee and then be fighting 5 months later seems like a pretty quick turnaround. So maybe they found that it wasn't as bad as they initially thought. But that's the fight that they're talking about right now. Really good fight, and I think it's going to be at 155. It's going to be between Rafael dos Anjos dropping back down against Islam Makhachev. Makhachev's a guy who's been hanging around the bottom of the top 15 for a while, has been waiting for a guy who's ranked above him, or at least has a big name, to step up and take a fight for him to get a win against and then work his way up. I think his last fight was actually against Davi Ramos this time last year. So it's good that he'll at least have an opportunity to get back in there. He was supposed to fight on the card that Khabib was going to be on, but with all the issues that Khabib had and then the issues with Khabib's dad, he had to drop off. So he should be making a return soon. Uriah Hall versus Anderson Silva. This will be Anderson Silva's final fight in the UFC. Fun matchup with Uriah Hall. You'd imagine he'll be on the feet for the most part. Hall might try to take him down. It seems like he's been working takedowns a little bit more lately. But still, I think for the most part, this fight will be on the feet. Hall will probably respect Silva and just try to keep it there, and we'll see if Anderson Silva's quick enough to get some counters off on Hall, or if Hall's going to put Anderson Silva on his highlight reel, which would be a little bit unfortunate of an end for Anderson Silva. But either way, it's still going to be a fun fight and one worth watching. And then the last one to mention is one I've kind of already mentioned, is between Curtis Blades and Derek Lewis. Pretty big fight at heavyweight between a couple top 5 guys. So that covers it for this week. Next week I'll be recapping UFC Vegas 8, and then previewing the card that'll be coming up after that. And again, I'm sure there'll be some more news that comes up. Probably nothing as big as what happened this week with John Jones vacating his title, but I'm sure other stuff will come up, and I'll be sure to talk about it.